Have you ever been made to feel invisible in your own home? It's a strange, hollow feeling, like you're living under the same roof with people who see through you, not at you. For years, I carried this weight, moving through the daily routines as if I mattered, even though everything I did was quietly dismissed. The meals I prepared, the errands I ran, the little things I fixed or managed, all taken for granted, as if they were automatic, as if I were just a background fixture. Until one day they said it out loud: I was replaceable. Not in a heated argument or a moment of anger, but stated calmly, confidently, like a fact everyone already knew and accepted. That nothing would change if I stopped helping, stopped supporting, stopped holding everything together. That my absence wouldn't leave a mark. I remember the moment vividly. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that buzzes with unspoken truths. They didn't shout or accuse, they simply told me with certainty that I was interchangeable. That my presence didn't matter. It wasn't a question, it was a conclusion. And it hit me harder than any fight ever could. Because it wasn't just words, it was the culmination of years of feeling unseen, unheard, and unvalued by the people I called family. Stay with me until the end of this story. What happened next revealed something none of us expected. Instead of getting angry, trying to prove them wrong, or demanding recognition, I made a quiet decision. I chose to stop doing one thing, the one thing they never acknowledged but depended on more than anything else. I didn't make a scene. I didn't confront anyone or threaten to leave. I simply stepped back and watched. I withdrew the invisible thread that had been holding everything together. Living under the same roof with those who dismiss your worth feels like walking a tightrope every day. There's a constant emotional invalidation, a subtle, quiet control where your efforts are expected but never appreciated. They depend on your presence, your work, your support, yet deny the very existence of your sacrifice. It's a paradox that breeds loneliness in a place that should feel like home. You might wonder what it was that I stopped doing. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was something so ordinary and overlooked that its absence slowly began to reveal the cracks in the foundation my family thought unshakable. I didn't argue or seek revenge. I simply stopped doing one thing, and everything began to fall apart. What unfolded was not chaos, but clarity, a truth that silence exposed more clearly than any confrontation ever could. If you've ever been made to feel replaceable, like your presence is just background noise or an invisible thread holding things together, you might see yourself in what comes next. This isn't a tale about striking back or proving anyone wrong. It's quieter than that. It's about what happens when you stop carrying the weight that others no longer recognize, when you set down the invisible burdens you've been holding onto for far too long. I didn't choose this path because I wanted to hurt anyone. In fact, it was the opposite. It was a kind of surrender, a gentle stepping back to see if anything truly depended on me, or if I had been carrying a story alone, one that no one else was even aware they were part of. The moments I withdrew were small, almost imperceptible. No shouting matches, no dramatic exits, just a gradual easing away from the roles I'd been cast into without asking. Stay with me because what happened after I stepped back changed everything, but not in the way I, or anyone, expected. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of something new. It was as if the quiet finally made space for truths that had been buried beneath years of habit and unspoken expectations. I won't pretend it was easy or immediate. This kind of unraveling takes time, and sometimes the slow reveal is the most painful kind, but also the most illuminating. If you find yourself in these words, please know you're not alone in this feeling of invisibility or being taken for granted. Sometimes the most profound changes don't come from fighting harder, but from quietly letting go, from allowing the space to grow where there once was only carrying. What you're about to hear is the story of what happened next, one small act of stepping back that unfolded into a surprising kind of freedom. Over the years, my place within the family didn't vanish overnight. It wasn't marked by a single harsh word or a sudden dismissal. Instead, it was a gradual fading, a slow dimming of presence that no one seemed to notice or care to stop. I remember the early days when my suggestions were met with polite interest, when my efforts were acknowledged with a simple thank you or a nod. But as time went on, those moments grew fewer and farther between, replaced by silence or worse, indifference. My voice became background noise, something to be heard but not truly listened to. I would bring up ideas, offer help, or share my thoughts, only to be met with half-hearted responses or quick changes of subject. Invitations to participate in family decisions became rare, and when I did speak, my words seemed to drift past others as if I weren't there. The chores I once took pride in doing were now done by someone else without so much as a thanks. It wasn't that my contributions stopped being valuable, they were simply overlooked, as if taken for granted by default. The more I tried to assert myself, the more I felt pushed to the sidelines. The subtle disrespect wasn't always obvious. It was rarely overt or cruel. Instead, it came in the form of dismissive comments, sighs, or the way my presence was ignored during conversations. If I asked for help or support, I was told I was being too sensitive, or that everyone else has problems too. Gradually, I began to internalize these messages. The phrase replaceable wasn't suddenly thrown at me like a dagger. It was whispered repeatedly in small ways, through the way my efforts were brushed off, the way others stepped in without asking, the quiet assumption that I could be swapped out without consequence. There were times when I caught myself shrinking, not because I wanted to, but because it felt safer. Being unseen hurt, but being noticed only to be dismissed hurt more. I learned to keep my distance, to lower my expectations, and to silence the part of me that longed to be valued. The emotional erosion was slow and relentless, chipping away at my confidence and sense of belonging. It created an invisible barrier between me and those who should have been closest, a barrier built from years of neglect disguised as normal family dynamics. Despite all this, I still hoped for change, for recognition of my worth. But hope became harder to hold on to as the pattern repeated itself day after day. The cumulative effect was exhausting, a quiet ache that lingered beneath the surface. I wasn't just invisible, I felt disposable, as if my presence was something the family tolerated rather than cherished. This wasn't a story of sudden cruelty but of gradual neglect, a daily erasure that left deep scars. Looking back, I realize how much this invisibility shaped my understanding of myself and my place in the world. It taught me about the power of being overlooked, the weight of unspoken rejection, and the quiet despair that comes with being marginalized where you should feel safest. But it also planted a seed of awareness, a recognition that this slow fading wasn't my fault or my failure. It was a reflection of a family dynamic that didn't hold space for me, that didn't see me as integral. In the silence of being unseen, I began to understand the importance of reclaiming my own voice and value, not through loud declarations or confrontations, but through quiet acts of self-care and boundaries. The years of being minimized didn't erase me, they reshaped me, teaching me painful lessons about resilience and the need for self-recognition when others fail to provide it. It was a harsh, slow lesson in invisibility that paradoxically became the foundation for a new kind of freedom. The fabric of our household was held together by countless small, unseen threads I wove silently day after day, without fanfare or acknowledgement. I was the quiet engine running in the background, the one who anticipated needs before they were spoken aloud, who absorbed the weight of tension without complaint, and who smoothed over rough edges so the family could continue without disruption. This role wasn't assigned or requested, it was simply expected, as natural and inevitable as breathing. No one paused to thank me or even notice the effort. It was as if the work I did belonged to the invisible realm, where labor goes unnoticed because it is presumed endless and effortless. I managed the emotional currents that pulsed beneath the surface of our home, the subtle moods, the unspoken worries, the undercurrents of fatigue and frustration that no one voiced but everyone felt. When a sibling was stressed, I'd step back to give space, yet stay close enough to catch the signs that something was wrong. When a parent's day had been long, I softened my tone, adjusted my own expectations, and offered quiet companionship without demanding anything in return. This emotional labor was relentless and exhausting, but it was never framed as labor at all. It was simply who I was supposed to be, the peacemaker, the steady presence, the one who absorbed discomfort so others wouldn't have to. Alongside this, I carried the logistics of daily life, coordinating schedules, keeping track of appointments, managing household tasks that no one else seemed to notice or consider. I handled the mundane but essential details that kept things running smoothly, making sure bills were paid on time, groceries were stocked, and the smaller emergencies never spiraled out of control. This work was invisible precisely because it was so consistently done. It became a given, a silent baseline that no one thought to question or appreciate. The invisible scaffolding supporting the family's everyday existence was my responsibility, and I bore it alone. Financially, I chipped in quietly, though never in a way that drew attention. I contributed what I could, stretched resources when necessary, and made sacrifices without complaint. This support was unacknowledged because it was expected, a quiet duty that belonged to me by default. No one asked for help, they assumed it would be there. It was a form of giving that felt more like a debt than a gift, and with it came the weight of being taken for granted. My contributions were invisible not because they were small, but because the family had grown accustomed to my presence as a resource rather than a person. The stability I provided was a constant undercurrent. I held the line when everything else felt uncertain. Even when I felt frayed inside, I maintained a calm exterior so others wouldn't fall apart. This endurance was not a heroic choice but a survival mechanism born out of necessity. I learned early on that my role was to be the constant, the reliable one, the fixer who could be counted on to keep the household functioning no matter what. Yet this very reliability became a trap. Because I never demanded recognition, because I never made my work visible, the family began to see me not as irreplaceable but as interchangeable. If I was always there, always doing the same things without complaint, then who else could not do them? The assumption grew that anyone could step in, that my role was not unique but a default setting. This perception of replaceability stemmed directly from the invisibility of my contributions. When labor is unseen, its value is diminished in the eyes of those who benefit from it. The more I faded into the background, the more the family believed my presence was optional rather than essential. They didn't realize that what kept the household afloat wasn't just the tasks themselves, but the care, the attention, and the emotional energy I invested in every quiet moment. No one asked me to do these things anymore, they simply expected them. And because these expectations were unspoken, so too was the gratitude, or even the acknowledgement, that should have accompanied them. In this silent, invisible role, I became the family's shadow, always there, always working, always giving, yet never seen for who I truly was. This realization was painful, but it was also the key to understanding why I had to reclaim my voice, to step out of the shadows and show that the foundation I provided was not an infinite resource, but a person deserving recognition and respect. The moment unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary evening. We were gathered around the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant clatter of dishes filling the space with a mundane background noise. I had just shared a thought, something tentative, an attempt to express a feeling I'd held close for too long. Instead of the warmth or concern I might have hoped for, the response came with an unsettling ease. One of them, leaning back in their chair with a casual tilt of the head and a half-smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, "If you weren't here, someone else would just fill your role." The voice was calm, steady, even almost cheerful in its certainty. There was no anger, no malice, just a simple statement delivered as if it were an unquestionable fact, like the weather or the time of day. I froze, my breath catching somewhere between my chest and throat. Their posture was relaxed, hands folded over their stomach, eyes flicking briefly to a phone screen before returning to mine without hesitation. The ease with which they said it was what stung the most. There was no need to convince me, no urgency to soften the blow, they had no doubt, no hesitation. It was as if my presence was merely a convenience, an interchangeable part in a machine that would continue running smoothly without missing a beat. The expression on their face was calm, almost indifferent. The faint arch of an eyebrow suggested mild curiosity rather than concern, as if they were surprised by my silence rather than the weight of their words. The others at the table continued their conversations, their voices merging into a soft murmur, oblivious or unwilling to acknowledge the tremor that had passed through the air like a faint but sharp breeze. I remember the way my own hands rested on the table, fingers twitching slightly, as if unsure whether to retreat or push back. My heart pounded quietly, a slow but persistent rhythm that underscored the sudden emptiness growing inside me. In that moment, the carefully constructed illusion I had clung to, the belief that I was essential, valued, irreplaceable, crumbled with a subtle finality. There was no drama, no confrontation, no raised voices or desperate pleas. Just that simple, casual statement, spoken with the confidence of someone who truly believed it. It wasn't meant to hurt, it was merely the truth, as they saw it. And in that truth, I saw my place in the family stripped bare, not a cornerstone, but a placeholder. A role that could be filled by anyone willing to keep the routine going, to maintain the surface calm. The quiet shattering of that illusion was more devastating than any argument or outburst could have been. It left me sitting there, caught between disbelief and a growing clarity. The foundation I thought I stood on was not made of solid stone but shifting sand. And while the family continued their lives around me, unaware or indifferent, I felt myself retreating inward, gathering the fragments of a self that had been invisible for far too long. That night, the silence wasn't just the absence of words, it was the presence of a new, painful understanding. The realization that my being there was not a gift or a bond, but a convenience. And with that, the last thread holding my illusions in place quietly snapped. I began to see, with a clarity that was both unsettling and illuminating, that the stability my family depended on was built not on grand gestures or shared dreams, but on the quiet, unseen labor I performed daily. The routines I maintained, the meals prepared without thanks, the schedules managed without acknowledgement, the emotional storms weathered alone, had become the invisible glue holding everything together. It was as if the very foundation of our home rested on a fragile web of my consistency, yet no one seemed to notice the threads I spun. In fact, their invisibility was so complete that it felt as if my efforts were simply part of the background, an unspoken expectation rather than a valued contribution. This realization cut deep because it exposed a paradox I had lived within. The more dependable I was, the less I was truly seen. My reliability became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was the reason the household functioned smoothly, the reason chaos was kept at bay. On the other, it rendered me invisible, a constant presence so normalized that my needs and existence were easily overlooked. Being dependable, I learned, was not just about showing up, it was about disappearing into the role I had been assigned, willingly or not. The very act of holding everything together meant that I was no longer a person with desires or vulnerabilities, but a fixture, an unchanging element of the family landscape. Irony settled heavily on my chest. The more I proved myself essential, the easier it became for others, and perhaps even for myself, to believe that I didn't matter beyond the functions I performed. My consistency, once a source of pride, transformed into a form of entitlement that the family took for granted. There was no gratitude in their eyes, no recognition that my presence was a choice, a sacrifice even. Instead, my efforts were expected, demanded without question or pause. The emotional labor, the careful navigation of tensions, the invisible work of keeping the peace, all of it became a given, as if I were a machine programmed to maintain equilibrium without complaint. I found myself questioning the nature of love and belonging within these walls. Was it love that demanded such invisibility? Or was it something else entirely? Habit, convenience, habit masquerading as family? The patterns I had fallen into were so deeply ingrained that they felt unbreakable. Each day I moved through my roles with practiced ease, masking the growing emptiness inside. Yet beneath this surface, a quiet rebellion stirred. I recognized that my invisibility was not a neutral state but a symptom of something broken, a silent plea for acknowledgement whispered in the spaces between conversations and overlooked moments. This realization did not come with anger or bitterness at first. It was more a somber understanding, a weighing of truths long ignored. I saw how the family's stability was a fragile ecosystem, balanced precariously on my sacrifices. Without my steadiness, cracks would appear, chaos might seep in. Yet paradoxically, this vital role rendered me less visible as a person and more as a function. The more I held everything together, the more I dissolved into the background, becoming a ghost in my own home. It was a painful clarity, that my worth had been measured not by who I was, but by how well I kept the world from falling apart. In that moment, I realized that being dependable had become a chain, binding me to a form of invisibility I had accepted but never fully understood. The consistency I offered was a currency, but one that bought silence instead of recognition. And in the quiet aftermath of this understanding, I faced a choice: to continue fading into the shadows of my own making or to find a way to reclaim my presence, to insist on being seen not just as the glue but as the person holding it. The decision didn't come with fanfare or confrontation. It was not announced in a burst of anger or a grand declaration. Instead, it settled quietly within me, like a whispered truth that needed no validation. I chose to stop, not because I wanted to punish anyone or make a spectacle of my feelings, but because I finally recognized the cost of my own invisibility. The weight of always being there, always available, had become a silent burden, one I carried alone without complaint, until the moment I simply stopped. No explanations were given, no demands made. I withdrew my offering of unwavering dependability, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of self-preservation. That moment of choice was less a dramatic turning point and more an internal release. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The pattern was clear enough without my commentary: the way my efforts were overlooked, the way my presence was expected yet unacknowledged, the way I was treated as a fixture rather than a person. I watched quietly as the space I once filled began to feel different, and with it, I began to feel different too. It wasn't about revenge or making them realize my worth by absence. It was about reclaiming a sense of agency over my own life. To stop was to step back from the edge of that invisibility, to no longer allow myself to be the silent background to their narratives. In the days that followed, I observed more than ever. Without the noise of my constant giving, I could see the interactions for what they were, patterns of expectation without reciprocity, moments where my silence was met with indifference rather than concern. It was a quiet revelation, and it stung more because it was so unspoken. But I held on to that silence. I chose observation over confrontation, understanding over anger. There was a dignity in that stillness, a refusal to be drawn into cycles of blame or resentment. Instead, I focused on what I could control, my own boundaries, my own willingness to be seen and valued on my own terms. If you've ever felt taken for granted or as if your presence is just a given in your family, I invite you to share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the loudest stories are the ones left unspoken, and there is strength in recognizing that we are not alone in this quiet struggle. The decision to stop doing that one thing was less about the act itself and more about what it represented, a subtle but profound shift in how I allowed myself to be treated. No longer the silent caretaker, I became a silent observer, watching how the space I left behind was filled or left empty. It was not an act of retaliation but a boundary drawn in the softest ink, a message sent not in words but in the absence of what was once freely given. And in that absence, I began to find a new kind of presence, one rooted in self-respect and quiet strength rather than the need for external acknowledgement. The first subtle shifts were almost imperceptible, like faint ripples on a still pond, but they set the tone for everything that followed. At first, it was the small things, an unanswered question, a glance that lingered too long, a hesitation before speaking. The family moved through their routines with a slight stiffness, their motions less fluid, their voices carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. It wasn't chaos or confrontation, it was something more elusive, a slow unraveling of the familiar fabric that had once held us all together. I noticed it in how Mom paused mid-sentence, her eyes darting away when I entered the room. She'd start to say something, only to fall silent, as if searching for words that wouldn't come or maybe words she was afraid to say aloud. Dad, usually steady and composed, would frown over the morning paper more often, as though trying to decipher a puzzle that didn't quite fit. The kids, too, seemed caught between confusion and frustration, glances exchanged in hallways, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I neared. There was a shared hesitation, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to break the tension. What unsettled me most was the denial. It was subtle but pervasive. "Nothing's wrong," was the unspoken mantra that echoed in silences and half-hearted reassurances. When I asked about the awkwardness, they would brush it off with forced smiles or vague excuses. "Just busy, or you're reading too much into it," they'd say, as if insisting on normalcy could make the unease vanish. But the normalcy was fraying at the edges, and I could see it in the way conversations stalled, in the way laughter felt a little too loud or a little too forced. Dinner time, once a sanctuary of warmth and connection, became a quiet affair. Plates were pushed around more than eaten, and words were sparse. When someone tried to bring up a topic, the others would quickly shift the subject or respond with non-committal murmurs. I could feel the weight in the air, pressing down, making even the simplest exchanges feel strained. It was as if we were all circling around something unsaid, a tension that neither dared to name. Frustration began to surface in small, almost unconscious ways: a slammed cabinet door, a sigh too deep to be casual, the occasional sharp tone that caught everyone off guard. Yet, no one confronted the source directly. Instead, the irritation simmered beneath the surface, turning the atmosphere brittle and fragile. I sensed that everyone was trying to maintain appearances, to hold on to the semblance of togetherness, even as the foundation beneath us cracked. I found myself watching more closely, piecing together these fragments of discomfort. There was a growing disconnect between us, not marked by loud arguments or dramatic scenes, but by a quiet withdrawal. People stopped seeking each other out. Invitations dwindled, and the spaces where we once gathered shrank. The living room, once filled with shared stories and laughter, felt emptier, shadows lengthening in the corners where light used to linger. At night, the silence stretched longer than usual. The usual hum of evening routines faded into an uneasy quiet. Even the subtle sounds, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of pages, seemed amplified in the stillness. I could feel the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing against the walls, the invisible barrier that had grown between us since I stepped back. It was a slow, creeping distance, not marked by grand gestures, but by the absence of the small, everyday affirmations that had once kept us close. In those moments, I understood that the absence I created was more than just a physical space. it was an emotional vacuum that everyone was struggling to fill or ignore. The family's confusion and frustration were tangled with a deep denial, a refusal to acknowledge the shift that had quietly, inevitably begun. The cracks were forming not with a crash but as a faint, persistent sound, like the first tremors of a storm that no one yet dared to name. The moment I stepped away, the illusion of my replaceability shattered like glass underfoot. It wasn't a sudden collapse but a slow unraveling, one missed deadline and one overlooked detail at a time. The house, usually humming with the quiet order I maintained, fell into a dissonant silence that no one had anticipated. Tasks I once handled with seamless precision now piled up, unattended, as if my absence had sucked the air from the room itself. The confidence that everyone displayed before, the casual assurance that I was just one among many, began to crack under the weight of reality. At first, my departure was met with barely concealed relief from some, a quiet hope that things might run smoother without my constant presence. But that hope was fragile, quickly replaced by confusion and frustration. The morning after I left, the breakfast table was a testament to neglect: empty cartons, half-brewed coffee, and a stack of unopened mail that had grown taller than anyone cared to admit. The routine I had woven into the family's daily life, the invisible threads that kept everything moving, were suddenly missing. No one had prepared for the chaos that followed. As the days passed, the consequences of my absence rippled outward in unexpected ways. The carpool schedule I managed fell apart, leaving children stranded and appointments missed. Dinner was often skipped or hastily ordered, creating a growing tension that no one knew how to address. The family home, once a place of steady rhythm, became a space of disarray and quiet resentment. It was a stark contrast to the confident declarations made before, assurances that I could be replaced, that my role was interchangeable. Those words now rang hollow against the backdrop of daily failures. What struck me most was the emotional fallout. The family's confusion turned to guilt, then to a kind of desperation. Attempts to fill the gap I left were clumsy and half-hearted, revealing just how deeply embedded my presence had been. The void was not just practical but emotional. My steadying influence, my ability to anticipate needs and smooth over tensions, was irreplaceable. Conversations grew strained, and the easy camaraderie that once filled the rooms was replaced by awkward silences and unspoken grievances. I watched from a distance as they tried to patch the holes left in the fabric of our lives. There was a moment when my youngest, usually so self-contained, clung to me with a quiet fear that spoke volumes. It was in that embrace, tight and trembling, that the truth became undeniable. I wasn't just a cog in the machine, a disposable piece easily swapped out. I was the linchpin, the quiet force holding everything together. Their earlier confidence, the dismissive smiles and casual remarks, gave way to a palpable uncertainty, a collective realization that they had underestimated the depth and breadth of my role. This shift was not about blame but about recognition. The family, once sure they could manage without me, now faced the reality that my absence left more than just empty spaces. It exposed vulnerabilities they had refused to acknowledge. The calm surface of their certainty was replaced by a restless questioning, a search for answers that no one yet found. In those moments, the belief in my replaceability dissolved, replaced by a profound understanding of my true significance. The weight of this truth hung heavy in the air, a silent acknowledgement that nothing would ever be the same. The storm I had sensed earlier had arrived, subtle but relentless, and it demanded change. The family's confidence had been a fragile facade, and now, standing amid the wreckage of that illusion, they had no choice but to confront what my absence truly meant. It was a turning point, not just for them but for me, a moment when the unspoken realities finally surfaced, altering the course of everything we had known. The room, once lively with easy chatter and shared routines, now held a tangible stillness that neither welcomed nor comforted. The air was thick with unspoken truths, and the usual cadence of voices had shifted into something quieter, more restrained. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension, reflecting it back in the form of a subdued atmosphere, where every glance and gesture carried a weight previously unnoticed. The family no longer moved in harmonious rhythm. Instead, they navigated a fragile dance, each step tentative, each word measured. That fragile facade of confidence had crumbled, revealing cracks that spread beyond the surface. The realization that things weren't fixing themselves settled heavily among them, and with it came a change in how power was wielded and understood. Previously, authority had been implicit, resting on an unspoken assumption of competence and presence. But now, the absence that had once been overlooked was glaringly evident, and with that exposure, the dynamic shifted. No longer could control be taken for granted or exercised with ease. Instead, subtle maneuvers replaced overt commands, and silence became a tool as much as speech. Conversations shortened, statements that once flowed freely were clipped, edged with a new wariness. There were no apologies, no admissions of fault, only a careful recalibration of roles. Attempts to assert control surfaced in small, almost imperceptible ways, adjusting the volume of a voice, insisting on the order of daily tasks, or choosing when and how to engage. These gestures were not pleas for forgiveness, but rather quiet claims to stability, expressions of resilience in the face of uncertainty. The effort was less about reconciliation and more about maintaining an illusion of order, even as the foundations beneath them shifted. Dependency, once a silent undercurrent, now stood exposed, altering the balance of power. The family members who had relied on assumed support were forced to confront their vulnerability. In this new landscape, reliance did not guarantee influence or respect. Instead, it invited scrutiny and a subtle reallocation of authority. Those who had been caretakers found themselves confronting their limitations, while others struggled with the discomfort of newfound responsibility. The roles that had seemed fixed began to blur, and with that blurring came a tension that neither side fully acknowledged but both felt deeply. Silence, in particular, became a language unto itself. It spoke of frustration, disappointment, and an aching recognition that some things could not be undone with words alone. In those quiet moments, the family's collective breath seemed held, as if waiting for a sign, a gesture, or a decision that might restore balance. Yet, no such resolution came easily. Instead, the silence stretched, punctuated only by the subtle sounds of everyday life continuing despite the fractures beneath. The tone of interactions shifted as well, less warm, more guarded. Where once there had been laughter and easy understanding, now there were pauses filled with hesitation. Words carried an edge of restraint, as if each statement had to be weighed against potential repercussions. This new dynamic was neither open confrontation nor peaceful acceptance. It was a careful negotiation of space and influence, where power was no longer inherited but contested in small, quiet ways. In this altered family landscape, control was less about commanding and more about survival. Each member sought to assert their importance, not through grand gestures but through the minutiae of daily life, claiming a seat at the table, deciding when to speak, choosing what to withhold. These acts, though subtle, were charged with meaning. Tiny battles fought in the silence between words, where authority was claimed and contested without need for declaration. The shift was profound because it laid bare the interdependence that had always existed beneath the surface yet had been denied or ignored. Now, dependency was no longer a hidden weakness but a defining feature of their interactions. It reshaped relationships, forcing a reconsideration of what strength meant when support could no longer be taken for granted. And within that redefinition, the family found itself navigating unfamiliar territory, uncertain, unsettled, but undeniably changed. It's often said that people are replaceable, a phrase thrown around casually, but its true weight is rarely understood until life shifts dramatically. Under the same roof, you may feel invisible, your presence taken for granted, your contributions overlooked. But the truth, as we've seen, is that this perception stems not from your lack of value but from the inability of others to imagine a life without what you quietly provide. When the roles we play are suddenly altered, when the steady support we offer is withdrawn or disrupted, the fragile illusion of replaceability shatters, revealing the profound dependence that was always there beneath the surface. This realization is both humbling and empowering. It's a call to recognize your own worth beyond the silent labor, the unseen emotional work, and the constant giving that often goes unacknowledged. The story unfolding within these walls is not just about control or emotional injustice, it is about resilience, about quietly carving out personal victories even when the environment seems unyielding. It's about understanding that being taken for granted doesn't diminish your significance. Rather, it highlights the invisible threads that hold the family fabric together, threads you have woven with patience and strength. To those still living with emotional invalidation, to those who feel unheard, unseen, or undervalued, know this: your quiet contributions are the backbone of the life you share with others. Your presence is not just needed, it is irreplaceable. The challenge lies not in convincing those around you of your worth, but in embracing it yourself. When you start to see the power in your persistence, the dignity in your patience, you begin to rewrite the narrative imposed upon you. You are not invisible, and you are certainly not replaceable. If you find yourself navigating these complexities under the same roof, remember you are not alone. There is strength in shared stories, in voices rising together to speak of family control, emotional injustice, and the often unseen personal triumphs that define everyday life. This channel is a space for those real stories, a community where your experience matters and your resilience is celebrated. Subscribe now to join us in uncovering the truths hidden beneath the surface, to hear more about the struggles and victories that happen quietly but matter profoundly. Together, we can illuminate the unseen, give voice to the silenced, and affirm the irreplaceable value you bring to your world. Your story deserves to be told and heard.